Hey there, Nick Gentakis here. In this video, we're going to go over manually testing your production configs in development. And this video is going to be a post-mortem of how I almost took down production for one of my clients. So there's a number of web frameworks out there that have this idea of you can load in different config files depending on which environment you're running your application in. For example, you have development, testing, staging, and production. And the idea there is you can differentiate your different configs for each environment, and whatever environment you're running into, it is going to load that specific config file. And I already wrote out this blog post, and I'm going to sort of narrate this one in video, but I'm going to add some asides and maybe some extra context as we go here. And by the way, it will be hosted on nickgenatakis.com. Right now it's on localhost because I didn't publish it yet, but yeah, I'll leave a link to this one in the description. So yeah, this all starts with this going to be a post-mortem of how I almost took down production. And this happened to me very recently last week where I was doing some client work and their code base is using PHP CodeIgniter 3. And I really do think this is a great example of knowing just enough to be dangerous, because I have worked with PHP in the early 2000s for a number of years, but kind of wouldn't classify myself as a PHP developer today. Not because I think it's a bad language or anything like that. It's just, well, I am not writing, tens of thousands of lines a year of PHP. But, I can go through the code, trace things around, look things up, etc., and generally feel pretty comfortable. Although at this place that I'm at here, my role is not a PHP developer. I am a solo SRE / platform / app / I don't know, whatever you want to classify this as. But I do sometimes find myself making application level changes for, infrastructure or hosted related things like creating health check controllers or converting config items to environment variables, etc. Things like that. This is popping into the code, maybe changing 10 lines of code in a file, writing a test for it, and something like that. It works out really nicely because then the dev team can actually focus on delivering business value, and we all coordinate together to fill in knowledge gaps across the board. And the work I was doing, it would be code reviewed by one of the devs, and it would be tested as well by someone on the dev team. So that's really nice because it means an actual proper PHP developer can offer suggestions and improvements. And in my opinion, this makes this process completely okay in my book. So yes, the story behind this post. So CodeIgniter 3 allows you to define multiple config files for different environments, and it only loads a specific config file when you run your app in, let's say, production or staging mode. I mentioned before, quite a few web frameworks do. This is a pretty standard thing. So in this case, we had a few different config items duplicated across multiple environment config files, and I thought using a single environment variable that would be read in by our default config, it just felt like a better fit here. It's going to remove some duplication. And I don't know CodeIgniter a ton, but in all of our config files, we reference a variable called $config here, and we access properties in it like config, and then whatever the option happens to be, our configuration key value basically. So we had a very specific config production API.php file, and in there, I removed a custom config item that we had, and I moved it to our default just, config.api.php, and this file would then read the value from an environment variable. And this default file, it applies to all environments unless you override it. So the basic idea there is, the production file would win over the default one. Now, this feels like a pretty innocent refactor, right? Remove the config item from a couple of different config files across multiple environments, and then replace that with a single entry in the default config, and then just read from an environment variable. This way we can just set the environment and variable value to whatever it needs to be in each different environment. So that's exactly what I did. So I went into the config production API PHP file, and it looked basically almost exactly like this in the end. Now I have to redact some of the code here just for, contractual type of things. Like I'm not going to leak client code out to my blog here for their privacy, et cetera, not even tied into contracts. That's just like a crummy thing to do. But we had a single if condition here, not really important, but the takeaway here is it wasn't a comment. It was actual PHP code there. And then we just had a whole bunch of comments related to what was in this file here. Not super important for the sake of the video, but a little bit kinda. And, since this file wasn't empty of code, it had that actual if condition over here, and we had a whole bunch of comments that, someone wrote years ago and, it's been updated, et cetera, I kind of made a judgment call here to keep that file around. So normally I'm a fan of doing something and asking for forgiveness later, which kind of would have meant, deleting the file, but I'm not super familiar with PHP here, and I figured it's probably going to be a little bit more safe to just keep the file there. I didn't really think twice about that. So I made my changes and created the pull request. In the testing instructions, I mentioned this is modifying config files for a few environments, and just to be safe, maybe the tester can manually print out the config item to make sure the value is being populated correctly from the env variable here correctly, right? Like they can just go to the code base, pop in a print somewhere in some endpoint that they're going to call, and just make sure we get the right value. Now, we don't have unit tests at this level where, every single individual config item would be unit tested in isolation. And this manual test kind of just felt like a decent sanity check for the PR, even though we have a whole bunch of tests and absolutely would have been caught in one of them because, we do have tests testing that controller action where this config was actually being referenced. And also just a quick aside here, we mostly trust our tests, but the context of this one is a little bit out of the norm, right? I'm not some grizzled CodeIgniter veteran, and I'm committing code to a large app for a large company. So the company is private, so I'm really not going to get into too many details more about, number of employees or financial stuff like that. But the reason I was even confident in making this patch is because I have absolute trust in the dev team and our release process. I've also made a decent amount of code changes to the code base over the last year without any issues at all. Nothing that really, made changes like this to config files and stuff. Well, I did make some changes to config files, which also led to being a little bit more confident. But yeah, I've been around the block here with this code base. I'm comfortable making small, little surgical changes as needed. And so going back to the story over here, in any case, everything passed because the manual test was done in development mode, which loaded the development config, and the automated test also passed because it loaded the test config, right? Two different environments there. It got the seal of approval and it was pushed to production. Now, technically, we don't have any pre-prod environments yet, but to be fair, this hasn't been something that has been like routinely killing us, right? We're not just like breaking production left and right, and it's like, oh my God, if we had a staging environment, all of our problems will be solved. I also haven't been here long enough to really address the situation. Like for sure, we're going to have at least one pre-prod environment to be determined. Like, yes, it's on the horizon. But I've just been focusing hard now on moving all of our infrastructure into Terraform and also getting all of their services, all their applications running in Kubernetes, which actually just happened very recently. So now all 8 of them are running in Kubernetes very happily. Now, I'm not making any excuses here about not having a staging environment, et cetera, but I just wanted to shed a tiny bit of light here on why things are the way they are now, because I'm sure someone would be reading this paragraph and they'd be like, well, what about a staging environment? Why isn't it there? And here we go. Now, fortunately, Kubernetes prevented this version from going live because the app failed Kubernetes health check due to a CodeIgniter error that said it failed to merge in this config variable that was referenced in that file we just took a look at over here. Completely empty, right? Just the single if condition, but that's basically it, and some comments here. And while the PHP file itself wasn't empty of code, the production config, didn't have a single config variable, and under the hood, CodeIgniter 3, I don't know about 4, we're just not using 4 at the moment, but it's going to expect that if a config file exists, then there is going to be this $config to merge in. Now, I don't even know if this is custom code that our application developers did, or if this is like, baseline functionality with CodeIgniter 3. All I know is that, this is how our application works. And so that file didn't have this, and it just crashed and the app didn't start. So, since I'm not a hardcore CodeIgniter user, I didn't know that, and the person who reviewed the PR also didn't catch it. Now, I'm not blaming them for this one, because this is a pretty obscure thing, and, who knows, like, this may have been the first time this sort of thing came up in the lifetime of the app, which has been going for quite a number of years. Like, we're almost approaching a decade at this point. So what's interesting here, though, is actually if we had a staging environment or some pre-prod environment, it wouldn't have caught this error because it was directly related to the production config file, which only loads in production. Now, you could make a case like if we had a config staging API file and the value was removed from there, so basically the staging file looked exactly like the production one, then it absolutely would have gotten caught in staging as well. So I'll give you that. In fact, I didn't even think about that while writing this post here. And this post isn't like, dissing why you should or shouldn't have a staging environment. But that's an important detail because that's a reasonable thing. But in any case, this is how we turned out here. And what's really cool though about this is, Kubernetes kind of saved us here, even though we just have the production environment by itself. Due to just having a readiness probe set up, basically Kubernetes health check there, the app just didn't become healthy, so it wasn't put into the load balancer, it never served traffic, and the previous version of the application before we deployed this version was just continuously serving traffic as if it's, nothing happened. So then we saw that, and I just made a patch to fix the issue. Basically, all I did was delete the file and then commit that up and push it, make a new release, and then everything went healthy and it was good to go and everyone is happy. But there are some takeaways and lessons learned, I think, from this one, at least for me, for sure. So if your web application supports configs for multiple environments, treat these changes with a lot of care and respect, right? These are scenarios where you may mess something up in a different environment. And also consider maybe introducing a policy and checklist around changes to these files, which ensures that your app gets run in production mode or whatever environment you happen to be making changes for before your pull request gets merged. Perhaps this could be a manual test by developer doing the PR, as well as who's ever reviewing the PR. I also think there's room here to automate this just by having the application start up in production mode in CI to ensure at least the app starts successfully. Chances are you're not going to be able to run your test suite when the app is running in production mode because, you don't want to connect to production things and, environment variables and secrets and all this stuff are going to be different. But yeah, it should be fairly safe to at least start the application for most applications, unless you're doing something where like literally on app startup, you're doing like production level things. But in our case, we're not. So like this is actually a reasonable takeaway, at least for me here, to just improve our release process by doing something like that. And yeah, also having a health check, which also links to a health check video I've made in the past. I'll leave a card up to that one. But it's a really good idea to have health check set up to where it must pass before your app gets put into a load balancer to serve traffic. That's just a very good thing to have. So, you don't need to be using Kubernetes to get this functionality. Just Kubernetes makes it a little bit easy to do with their readiness probe. There's also startup probes and liveness probes and other probes. Well, basically, those are the only 3 for now. But yeah, it's sort of easy to do that. Nothing is really easy, but yeah, there's mechanisms in place with Kubernetes just to do that. If you're not using Kubernetes, then yeah, you may need to roll your own setup there. And another takeaway is that having a staging or pre-prod environment, shouldn't be blindly trusted to catch everything. This postmortem is pretty good use case of when production would have failed, whereas staging would have passed since it's loading different config files. Although, again, we kind of just talked about maybe if your staging environment file was exactly the same as production, then it would have been caught there. So maybe I'll make a tiny amendment to this paragraph as well. Also, even if you have a lot of checks and balances in your release process with a strong technical team, things are going to slip through the cracks. So I think you should embrace these as positive events. So when this happened, I didn't get flustered or upset or embarrassed or anything like that. Like, it actually made me happy to discover, weaknesses in both my own personal ability and our overall release process, right? This is something I now have an awareness of, and that's going to be able to follow me around no matter what tech stack I'm using. And yeah, just side topic about Rails here, not all multi-environment config file frameworks are affected by this. For example, with Rails, typically when you bundle up or, go and generate your production assets, you are going to be running Rails in production mode and then run your Rails assets precompile command. This is very similar to what you might do with Django as well, like collect static, et cetera, et cetera. So this command would actually happen during your build process. Maybe it's in a Docker file, maybe it's not, like depends on your setup here. But the idea there for sure is, when this command runs, when Rails is set to production or whatever web framework you're using, then it is going to be loading your production config file here. And if there's an error in there for whatever reason, you are going to see that in your build process before it gets a chance to even be deployed. But with that said, I do think all of the above takeaways are totally worth applying to a Rails app or, any other framework that's similar to how Rails works here. Because ideally you want to catch these things right as soon as possible. And you definitely want to have multiple levels of defense, right? This way, if one thing goes wrong, then something else is going to catch it instead of just depending on the one thing. This is really good practice for general security and whatever, things like this as well. So yeah, and then, I'm going to put a video here with timestamps, et cetera, et cetera. But before wrapping up, I kind of just want to go over a Rails application real quick here. So if I go to, let's see, and just to visualize like what that configuration stuff looks like here in a Rails app context, at least, right? We have a config directory. Then we've got environments here for, development and production and test environment as well. This is the baseline application. I do have this example application up on GitHub. I'll leave a link to this one as well. I keep it up to date, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea with Rails is, when you run a Docker Compose up here or basically running the whole entire Rails application, it is going to load up whatever environment you're running Rails in. So right now it's running in development mode. So it's going to be looking at this development file here. This one, it's not going to be looking at the production file. It's not going to be looking at the test file. Now, when I run the Rails test suite, yeah, sure, it's going to be looking at this file, but, not in development. So imagine, you're working on this application here and you're in the production file and you're making a change to the file. And like, I don't know, like, Ruby has these do end blocks here. And this is kind of silly here, but, if you put don't there, like, you get some hint from your code editor, hopefully. But this is a scenario where, yeah, this is completely invalid. Like, this is not valid Ruby code. This production config is going to break. We don't see it breaking here because I'd have to reload the application for Rails to pick up a new config file. That's just how Rails work here. This is how Rails does work here. But if I do a Docker Compose up now, it's still running in development mode. So this application is still going to boot up hopefully here. But we can see, yeah, the web service Puma here is the web server that I'm using, or application server. It's totally working. So if I went to localhost port 8000 here, we should get welcomed to the Rails application here. And yeah, there it is. So Rails is up and running in development. So just imagine this scenario where, you make a change to this file, basically what we just did here, and you only ever run your application in development mode or test mode. This file is not going to be detected as being a problem until you run your Rails app in production mode. But again, you're probably going to precompile your assets where you would see this. So for example, I'll just do a very quick, some changes here. So let's say these are the steps to run this application in production mode. So I don't want to run the assets stuff here. I also don't want to set development for Rails and Node being set to development. They're just going to default to production. What else do I need to do here? I think I need to set, Rails to actually serve static files. Normally, Nginx or a CDN or something would be serving them. Just for the sake of this video, this is an environment variable here where you can just have Rails serve static files. Then also I'm going to not override the web volume here, just so the public directory is mounted in. So this is going to be shutting this down. I'll run a run clean here also, just to delete any other lingering assets that might be around, basically clearing out the temp directory and some other stuff too. Then I'll just do a docker compose down just for good measure, make sure everything clean slate. Then I'll do a docker compose build here because these are instructions or, things that you need to do basically. Because if I go to this Docker file, when the Rails environment is set to production, it's actually going to run this precompile command here, and Rails environment defaults to production if you don't customize it. So we can see right away here that when it tried to run that Rails assets precompile here, it actually says, hey, by the way, in this production file, you have a syntax error here, and that's going back to this file that we just modified. Yep, this is no good. So we did get prepared, or, we got a little bit of safety from Rails itself there. And typically, this build command would be running in your CI pipeline because you can be building production image for that one. Boom, it would have been caught. Release wouldn't have went out, would have been saved. But yeah, not every web framework has this workfle. So yeah, I just wanted to show this real quick of kind of pulling together how this could be a problem for just some tech stacks. So with that said, let me know in the comments below if anything like this happened to you, because I love hearing little war stories around, how I took down production, or maybe in this case, almost took down production, because I think there are quite a few lessons learned around that. So with that said, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next video.